All right, are we ready to get started for the afternoon? Woo. Thank you. Thank you. Whew. How you doing so far? Hanging in there? All right. We have one more session, and they've all been so fabulous, so I can't really say that we've left the best for last, but I think Ellie did a great job of setting us up. And on that note, I would just like to give a shout out to Ellie and her team for really doing the heavy lifting of getting this particular conference together. So if you'll join me in saying thanks. So next we have Tyler Teixeira from the Harvard Business School, who's going to introduce the next panel. And he's a fabulous moderator because not only does he's an academic, but he also has industry experience, and he's done a lot of work in the eye tracking area. So with that, enjoy the next panel. Okay.
Thank you, Catherine. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd just like to talk a little bit about sort of, I think, what our goals are going to be, slightly different from the other panels. And I'm going to start with a story. About 10 years ago, I learned about this company. It's called Nissan. And they were creating these very different ads, and they tested these ads, and they got experts, and they got consumers to look at these ads. And basically, these ads tested off the chart. It was good in all dimensions. They had a new ad agency. They had a group of consultants to work with them. And they were all excited, and they started advertising nationally. And then as they did that, they obviously tried to track sales of the new models of cars. And by the way, they tested the models of cars. People were excited about these models of cars. So as they started testing these ads and trying to look at sales, sales essentially was sort of like similar to what they observed in the past, controlling for seasonality. And they said, okay, so let's crank up more advertising expenditures just so we can see the lift. They crank up more advertising expenditures, nothing happens in terms of sales. And then suddenly somebody said, what might be going on? Is this that these ads just don't work and all of our research and our ad developers were wrong? And then somebody said, well, let's try to see, essentially just count how many people stop by our dealers on the weekdays, on weekends, just to look at the cars. And when they started counting, they noticed that, wow, there's many more people going to the dealers than before. And so after a while, they noticed that the ads were getting people into the dealerships, but they were just not buying. And then they did all sorts of analysis and figured out that it was the in-dealer experience that was lacking for this company. And so that's just a story to talk about how important process is. We've been talking a lot about sales data, and that's obviously ultimately very important. Nobody will deny that. But understanding how to get to sales from advertising exposure is also very important. And we're going to talk about this. Two important measures of process that we know correlates with advertising effectiveness and with sales are attention as well as emotions. And these two presentations are going to talk about attention and emotions. So with that, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and the presenters. We have here Ann Rivers will start us off. Ann?
I'm Ann Rivers from BAV Consulting.
What is BAV Consulting, Ann?
We'll go through more of it on the presentation, but BAV Consulting is a way of measuring brands through brand equity and really the emotional connection people have with brands as opposed to just the typical sales measures.
Okay, so we have here Kirk Wakefield.
Yes, I'm Kirk Wakefield from the home of RG3 and Brittany Griner, and of course Baylor University.
Daniel McDuff.
Hi, I'm Daniel McDuff. I'm a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab, and my research is looking at emotions and narratives and stories, and in particular, how emotions in ads play out.
Herb Sorenson.
Yes, I'm Herb Sorenson. I'm with TNS Global and have been doing in-store research for 40 years with quite a bit of focus on media.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Herb. In May 14th of this year, the American Marketing Association just handed to Herb Sorenson the 2013 Charles Coolidge Marketing Research Award for ongoing advancement of marketing research practices. He will be given the award in Chicago on the 10th of June at the Art Forum. They say that in 2001, Herb invented and patented Path Tracker, a method to study shopper behavior in stores. This is a big deal for Herb. And I noticed that, not because I talked to him, but when I saw the list of past awardees, Robert Woodward Johnson, Peter Drucker, the famous management guru, George Gallup, who invented the famous Gallup studies, Paul Green from Wharton, Philip Kotler from Kellogg, and Robert Levine and Jagadish Seth. So I think that we should...
And Jerry Wind.
Oh, and Jerry, I forgot, Jerry Wind. So that's a remarkable accomplishment. I think we should acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you. I might say it's a little bit like, I feel like the dog, you know, that chased the car and caught it.
Okay.
What do I do now?
Oh, there's only downhill from there. So, and Orlando Bloom last speak.
Orlando Wood, actually, but I am often confused for
sorry.
Orlando.
Yes.
Orlando Bloom. I get Christmas
just
cards
like him.
to Orlando Bloom. People are a bit disappointed when they actually meet me. But anyway, I'm Orlando Wood. I am managing director of Brainjuicer Labs, which is the research and development team at research company Brainjuicer, and I've been working the last few years with the IPA in the UK, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, and the Effies just recently here in the US, to try and correlate, if you like, efficiency data from real campaigns in the real world with pre-testing measures, emotional pre-testing measures, and traditional pre-testing measures like persuasion, message takeout, and so on. So that's my bit.
Okay, so with that, who's going to present first, Anne?
So Kirk and I are going to talk a little bit about how sponsorships benefit brands. And as background for that, I want to walk you through a little bit of the BAV model. There's a lot of people here who know a lot about the BAV model, so I'm going to make it short because I think somebody at every table probably knows it better than they would like. It's a database on brands that we've been building since 1993. So at this point, we have information from about 750,000 consumers around the world in 276 studies in 51 countries. And in the US, we have a panel of 17,000 consumers that we talk to on a quarterly basis, about 3,500 brands. What's important about the BAV is that we measure brands in a category agnostic fashion. So we can measure Dannon right next to the NFL, right next to Wharton. So we understand really how people feel about brands as opposed to brands within a category. So now looking at the specific BAV model, we start with energized differentiation, which is really a brand's point of difference. And it shows that the brand has some momentum and something that je ne sais quoi about a brand, that you like it and you don't even know why. The second pillar is about relevance, and that is how relevant the brand is to you personally as a consumer. The third pillar is esteem, which is a regard measure and has a bit of reliability and leadership in it. And then knowledge is truly a measure of saliency. So it's not just awareness, it's how well do you actually know a brand. We put these all in a percentile rank across the 3,500 brands in the US to understand really the competitive context of every single brand in the marketplace. What's also important about the BAV model is that we've tied it to financial metrics. My background's in investment banking. I was at Bear Stearns, which is now a household name. And we have tied to show that the brand metrics are actually incremental to the accounting metrics in terms of explaining why one brand is outperforming the others in its category. When you look at a model of our choices in terms of brands to invest in compared to S&P, we've been winning handily even in down markets. The important pillar when we're talking about sponsorships is energized differentiation, which is often one of the ones that's the hardest to actually buy. It's really proving that you're different, distinctive, unique, innovative, and dynamic. Those are the true components of being a differentiated brand and having some momentum. This relates to pricing power. Ferrari has a lot of differentiation. What they're lacking is some relevance because most of us can't afford it. But it's different. We notice when it's parked outside. It's also the part that we want to see at the beginning of every brand in terms of any emerging brand. It's the thing that people see first. So for Kashi, when it was building up as a brand new brand, it was differentiated in the market because they were talking about something slightly different, and it had some momentum. And if something's happening to your brand, it's the first thing to go. So when you're a big brand, and I'm gonna leave some of my examples off for this one, but if you're a big brand, even like AOL a couple years ago, when differentiation starts to drop, it's a leading indicator of problems in the future. So this is often when we get calls in terms of trying to build that brand back up. And one of the ways to actually build differentiation is through sponsorships. So when taking apart the model, looking at fans and non-fans, this is really where you see the differences come up. So this is looking at NASCAR fans compared to not NASCAR fans. So we have normalized for all the other touch points by saying that the only thing different between these sets of people is their affinity to NASCAR. And you can see the biggest delta is truly in differentiation. It's not in knowledge, which is the awareness. So people don't do sponsorships for awareness. It's not going to drive your funnel next week, next month, hopefully maybe next year, but it's more about the differentiation of the brand as opposed to just the awareness of the brand. And you can see that it's consistent across all categories. That the improvement for Ford, though smaller, is really up into the high leadership spot, and for Sprint, it actually moves them significantly into a better space as well. And with that, I was going to turn it over to Kirk, who we did some work on looking at the actual impressions compared to the brand equity.
Thank you, Ann. Again, I want to thank Wharton for supporting us in this. It was a lot of fun. I guess I should start off really by saying, and now for something completely different compared to the experimental approaches we had this morning. That's a Monty Python reference. Okay, I see like 2 people. Probably the same response I noticed I got earlier from the RG3 and Brittany Griner. I thought saw like 3 recognizing faces. Those are athletes. So let me start with this other one. How many of y'all been to a NASCAR event? Okay, 5 of you, good. Well, maybe a few more than that. Okay, how about NCAA tournament where they have the big fan fest stuff outside, something like that? Anybody else gone to one of those? All right, we're getting a few more. All right, so that's the kind of venue that we're investigating. If you haven't been to a NASCAR event, okay, look, I don't get it either. I've gone to them. To the event that we worked, I had a pit row pass. I did go to the pit row. I looked around. Kid Rock was on the stage. I checked it out, and before the race, I left. Okay, that's sad. I know it. But we have been working together, Ann and I and BAV Consulting, to combine really this approach that looking at what is brand differentiation and how can brands really engage customers. So theoretically, the background for engagement and activation in advertising has been more of a passive engagement and activation. You can see, though, the Advertising Research Foundation redefined what engagement is. So turning on a prospect, we're hip. All right, turning on a prospect to a brand idea enhanced by the surrounding context. So that fits pretty well with what we're doing in sponsorships. You can see a few of the other sites that give us some information. And then looking at activation, again, not active, typically in advertising, we talk about activating the brand in the mind of consumers while they're, more or less passively consuming it. Whereas we look at it much more, again, physically active with respect to a sponsorship, much like the environments I explained to you. And you probably can't make it out on that scale up there, but there are some things we ask consumers post the event. What did they cognitively, what do they recall that they saw the sponsor doing that engaged them at the event? And it's just a 6-item scale. If we have a lot of brands, then I do it with just a summative scale, 0 to 6. If I have fewer brands, then I'll do it on a continuous scale. So we're looking at engagement and activation. How do we measure that? And also, how do we prompt it using RFID? So we partnered with another firm called Fish Technologies out of Dallas, who was partnered with the ISC, which is NASCAR, owns 12 of the tracks, including the one we worked. down in Miami. Somebody had to go there, that was I, to go to the event and check it out. So this is actually the front of the Miami, Homestead Miami Speedway on the front, using my iPhone 5, of course, with a cool panoramic effect. And these are the questions we wanted to answer. So what's the relative value of sponsorship engagement and driving the brand differentiation that Ann talked about? And how can we use RFID to track that and measure it? And then in comparison to traditional media, what's that additive effect of the sponsorship activation? And then also let's throw in the second screen of fans that are using their mobile phones or mobile in general to use either post on Facebook or to text or tweet about the event during the event. Some things that we asked, among very many other questions. I'm hoping that in the aftermath of this, we have a lot of things going on in this. I'm open and more than happy to entertain those of you who have some ideas of what's coolest about this. There's probably I hope more than one cool thing. But these are the main things we're looking at. So this is how the event worked out. The fans entered the gates. There was one big one that most people came through. If you haven't been to one of these events, they're attended by about 100,000, which is about the attendance at this one. They're there for 3 days. On average, fans spent 4 hours on Thursday, 6 hours on Friday, and 7 hours on Sunday at the event. Picture that, if you will. And they also often stay in RVs outside, for the entirety. So they checked in. You can see, you're probably already looking on the screen. You also notice number 3. That was me. So as you checked in, you received a lanyard, had an RFID tag in it. Everyone was intercepted and asked if they'd like to participate basically in a game. Given a lanyard, told if they checked in at more of 12 stations around the exterior of the facility, that they had a better chance of winning NASCAR-related prizes. And so I, of course, took one, and they also had 4 different stations with chances to stand in front of a blue screen and make it look like you're at some NASCAR-related event, and then upload it to Facebook, which is what that is. And those are the RFID stations that were at 12 different spots around the exterior. So a lot of the activation at NASCAR events, just like at those NCAA events, a lot of it occurs outside the perimeter, or outside the facility itself, although some is interior as well. The sponsors that they had, so their anchor sponsors, you can see the square footage that NASCAR provided us with what they paid for. Ford, it was the Ford EcoBoost 400, so they're the title sponsor. Sprint is the title sponsor for NASCAR Sprint Series. Okay, used to be the Winston Cup, So they are the title sponsor for the overall, event, year-long event. And then Speed TV and Coke and Army, those were the other anchor sponsors. It's a little bit misleading. Coke had smaller square footage, but they had the main thoroughfare with plenty of space they basically didn't pay for, that everyone congregated, and they had a stage. And you can see that picture, number 4, perhaps. There's a stage, and they had bands, artists, music there all day long, and people came and congregated in front of their space. So that 2,400 is misleading. It was as large as the other anchor sponsors. Then you see the secondary sponsors, some of whom were outside the gate, and one of the primary one, Army. Y'all probably didn't know that, but the Armed Forces spend a lot of money on sponsorships and a lot in NASCAR. So that's the square footage and just some of the pictures of each of those, of the activation points they had to engage fans. I don't expect you to read all this, just the short stuff of who we surveyed. We worked through NASCAR. They didn't allow, we were a little bit constrained. We were not allowed to ask or use their people that were in their current like season ticket holder type database. So these were other people that walked up, and I analyzed those individuals who completed our survey versus those who didn't complete it. Types of things you're supposed to do to look at your differences and those who responded. So in the end, we had 216 subjects who I was able to correctly match a post-event survey with our RFID data. Should have had a few more, but there were some issues. But 216 we can live with. So the results. This is a model we're working under, but there's some pieces of this that are, I think, more interesting that we'll focus on. But it does give you some of what we believe is going on. So we measured fan passion with a 4-item measure that gets at what their heart, life, soul, and mind is about NASCAR. So how passionate they are about NASCAR drives how much time they spend at the event. And then that gives them more opportunity to be engaged using the RFID, going to the RFID towers. We asked them about sponsors at the event, those, plus I had 2 foils, Apple and Rolex, just to see if they were, basically yay saying or nay saying. That orange line suggests that those who checked in at more RFID points would be more accurate in recognizing those weren't sponsors, so they'd recognize that they indeed weren't, and that's what proves to be the case. Those who were more passionate also are more likely to be using their second screens at the event and while watching on TV and so forth, and more likely to consume traditional media, which we included, by the way. Some of you might have judged by my earlier question here that I thought there was nothing to the new media. But actually, we find in both this and research I'm doing in Major League Baseball that consumption online of sports is at the same frequency as it is on TV and so on. So I'm considering that actually as traditional media. So we asked them that traditional media includes ESPN, Speed TV, NASCAR.com consumption. And then I also asked them about, again, their second screen behavior. But it's reported behavior, mind you, as opposed to monitored as much as we have on the digital studies earlier today. At any rate, we also measured sponsorship activation. In this case, it's again 6 items that we asked them about the sponsors. And then we measured differentiation based on the BAV model, and then also used Net Promoter Score, which probably many of you are familiar with, as a DV as well. So a few of the results that we've kind of parsed out here. So here you can see what happens with some of those anchor sponsors and their brand stature relative to the others. And we broke it down by those that were very passionate about NASCAR versus those with low passion. And you can see the effects on their brand usage consideration overall out of the BAV group, okay, out of overall ANDs, out of the BAV panel. And then we're going to break it down by those who were at the event. So just a little quick note here. It's kind of an aside, frankly. But the correlation to passion is kind of interesting. So being passionate alone about NASCAR is important, but that drives how much time you're spending at the track. Much like how passionate you are about someone drives how much attention you pay to them, right? But then the next steps after that may be another issue. But anyway, the more often that you're there at the track, you have a greater opportunity to engage in the RFID, and then the more frequently they checked into RFID, that drove the effect of activation. But frankly, neither, if you take the time at the event does not affect activation. So a lot of this goes back to, a lot of advertising is mere exposure effects. The theory is mere exposure, I'm there a lot of hours, I'm going to see Ford all over the place, and there's a mere exposure effect. But what we find is, if they're there for even 17 hours, but they are not actively engaged with the sponsors, there's no effect. It doesn't have a positive brand effect. So here are a few other slides that show that particular issue. So engaging with the RFID that we tracked across 3 days, 12 towers, so 36 total opportunities there to check in. And you can see the effects there with brand activation, and you can see perhaps you can see the dotted line that shows linear effect. And then you can see how it works out for the anchor sponsors. So overall, that activation as a result of the RFID tracking and engagement works out pretty well for Army and Sprint, and as well, and there's strong effects for the Coca-Cola, Ford, and Speed TV. And nicely, the foils didn't work out for them, right? So it shows that we weren't getting the yay-saying effect. People were recognizing the actual sponsors. I don't have on this slide, but also a question was, what about the secondary sponsors? The other 5, and the effects were there. They're significant, but they're not nearly as strong as they are for the anchor sponsors, not surprisingly. They had the huge spaces at the main gates. So again, here's the total time spent at the track, and then showing the corresponding effects on the sponsorship activation scores that we have from the respondents. And you see no effect from time spent, but you see in terms of the square footage, which also correlates strongly with their placement, so main gate, versus on the outside of the gates or further away. you see a strong effect in Ford, the anchor sponsor, and their activation, and the other anchors, and then basically the ones who didn't do much. And then here's the effects on brand differentiation or energized differentiation. And here again, we broke it down by those who noticed the brand activation at the event, and those of all the rest of our Miami respondents who didn't notice. They were there, but didn't engage. And you can see the differential effects on the differentiation across those sponsors. So by and large, again, for the anchor sponsors, you see noticeable effects and they're significant, whereas you get down to the lower level sponsors, you don't see much. And again, you see the reverse for the foils of Apple and Rolex, which you should. So overall, we looked at the relative effects. And so this is of the people that are at the Speedway, not just everybody out there, the NASCAR fans, but those people who are at the Miami Speedway, the activation that they noticed at the Speedway, the relative effect in our structural equation model shows that activation has a coefficient of 0.605, whereas all their consumption of ESPN, Speed TV, which shows all the races, and frequenting NASCAR.com, that only has a coefficient of 0.146. And the second screen, that is a significant effect, the 0.096. Obviously, it's not real strong. By the way, you might be surprised, but NASCAR fans don't tweet much. Okay? So if I included Twitter in here as a social media effect, it's actually not significant, so I pulled it. This is actually just Facebook and texting during events about the event. Okay? But that does have an additional effect. In addition to activation and additional media, the second screen effect is significant for the effect on the energized differentiation. And then you can see the subsequent things we know from the rest of BAV consulting. So these are the implication questions that I'll leave more for discussion, but we're still cogitating about and would love some input on what you think the meaning of our results are, and again, what you might think is most, I guess, the coolest thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk and Ann. Now we're going to have Daniel McDuff talk about affective advertising, automatic measurement of advertising effectiveness from emotional responses collected using the cloud.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about measuring emotional responses to ads online and the preliminary results we have on how those can map to ad effectiveness. Hopefully by the end of the talk, I would have convinced you that it's possible to capture interesting information about people's emotional responses while they watch ads, and we can do this from the comfort of their home by using a cloud-based framework. And this can also tell us interesting information about their liking of the content they're watching, but also other measures such as hopefully short-term sales impact of the ads. This is work done with Rana El-Kalioubi and Rosalind Picard, who's my advisor at the MIT Media Lab, and it was done also with Affectiva, who I was working with for the 6 months last year. So the main contributions are to present thousands of responses to online videos collected using, sorry, just a second.
Your slides are a little too cool for our system, I think.
that's better. Sorry about that. The main contributions are to show thousands of responses to online videos collected using a cloud-based framework. And these are facial videos, which are videos recorded while people watch ads online. The second is to use state-of-the-art computer vision algorithms which can automatically detect people's facial expressions on a frame-by-frame basis, so we get high-resolution temporal information about their expressions. And finally, to show preliminary results from models which are designed to map from these measurable responses to measures of ad effectiveness. And these measures of ad effectiveness that I'll be looking at are people's liking of the ads they're watching, and also present some very preliminary results on short-term sales. So more and more people are watching ads online, and they're watching or watching TV online in general, and they're watching this content on devices which often have sensors such as webcams, and they're connected devices, so they're devices that are allowing us to have a two-way connection with the viewer, so not only allowing them to watch content, but also via their camera we can also collect information about them. YouTube is a case in point, and is one example of how the way people are consuming media has changed and the way people are sharing media has changed. So how can we most effectively use these sensors that are around, and also the fact that there's connectivity between the device and the owner or the proprietor of the website to measure people's emotional responses to the content they're watching? Well, the status quo in emotion measurement might be to use surveys, interviews, or dial measures to capture people's response. And this can be simple and inexpensive, and in some cases quite effective. However, it does have drawbacks. It can be limited in sampling, such as in the case where you just ask or post hoc questioning about someone's emotional response to something they've just seen. It requires the user to cognitively evaluate their experience and evaluate their emotional, their emotions during watching the ad. And also there can be cases where people feel perhaps under pressure to report experiences that they didn't have. Here's an example of one such example where your interest level for a particular ad, or the relevance of that ad, is asked while you're watching it, and that's from the website Hulu. And it's a way of capturing people's interest or the relevance of an ad, but perhaps there's a way that we can do this automatically without having to ask people at every juncture. Is there a way that we can use the webcam to capture aspects of their response and therefore measure how much they like what they're watching? When measurement of emotions has gone beyond surveys and interviews, it might be that things like facial EMG are used. However, these are obtrusive and they require custom hardware which isn't available to everyone in their homes. And perhaps there's a way that we can distribute the data collection using sensors and new computer vision algorithms to measure people's facial activity without necessarily having this type of custom hardware. And in addition, not only allowing us to do it on a much larger scale, but also allowing us to do it in a much more comfortable way. So this brings me to the technical challenges which we hope to overcome in this work. The first is being able to measure people's responses beyond just cognitive evaluation, to be able to sample from a diverse and representative demographic which might be beyond people available in a small geographic locale, and to be able to measure responses remotely so that people can be in a natural setting rather than something that is perhaps alien. And finally, to map these measurable responses to metrics for success. So our approach is to measure people's facial expressions while they watch ads over the internet, and to sample from hopefully a large population and a more representative demographic than would be possible if we had to bring them to a lab, and also to make it more cost effective. We've developed computer vision algorithms for detecting facial expressions, and I'll talk about that in a minute. AI methods for mapping these responses to metrics for ad success, and all with the idea of finding a way of automatically measuring effectiveness outside the lab over the internet. Our data collection typically works like this. There'll be a website where people can watch some media content. Before they watch the content, they're asked to allow access to their webcam. And whilst they watch the media, if they've accepted the consent, then the video of their response will be streamed to a server where we can analyze it offline or in real time. And afterwards, typically, we'll ask self-report questions to get something that we can, something similar to what might be the status quo, to be able to map what we're seeing from people's faces with what they respond to in questioning. And this allows us to collect data very efficiently, and we currently have the largest collection of facial responses to ads or to media content in the world using this type of data collection. And as you'll see from some examples here, people respond typically very naturally, but also in very varied ways. There's a lot of difference in types of lighting conditions or their pose. People come from varying ethnicities, which can be a challenge from the technical side of things. I won't go into too many of the technical challenges, but one benefit of being able to collect data on such a large scale efficiently does allow us to really push the technology forward and make it more accurate and robust than was possible before. So once we have a response of someone watching some content, we analyze this and extract measures of their expressions automatically using algorithms. So we're looking principally at things like how much people are smiling, whether they're showing expressions of disgust, and the overall valence of their expression, so whether it's positive or negative. And these are based on Ekman's coding of facial behavior, but I could talk more about that afterwards if you're interested. And we extract features of those and then build statistical models for mapping those features to things like people's report of liking of the ad. So now I'm going to talk about some of the studies we've run, some of the data we've collected, and some preliminary results. So far, I've collected data for over 130 ads, and these come from a few different product categories, particularly pet care, chocolate, and chewing gum brands, instant food categories like pasta sauces, rice sauces, and breakfast cereals. We've run studies in France, Germany, the UK, and the US, and that includes over 1,300 panelists and approximately 15,000 facial responses to these ads. So it's a large amount of natural responses to content that people are watching from different locations, mostly at home, but they could be in other locations as well. The study designs look like this. So we contact people with a pre-survey in order to capture baseline measures of their brand likability and purchase intent. And then after a delay, we send them another contact in which they are allowed to watch a set of ads, and while we record their responses. And following that, we ask questions, again, about brand likability and purchase intent for the brands of interest and other distractors as well. And we also ask questions about willingness to share and how much they liked the content they were watching. Typically, viewers watch about 10 ads. There's obviously a boredom effect, so we don't ask them to watch too many, but there's a trade-off there between collecting data efficiently and getting a nice sample from a particular individual, but not allowing them to get too bored. And typically, each ad is watched by approximately 100 viewers, and this allows us to get really interesting, or uncover really interesting dynamics in the responses on an aggregate level, even if some people are inexpressive while they watch the ad. And so in terms of the metrics that we're trying to map these emotional responses to. So as I mentioned, we have pre and post measures of brand likability and purchase intent. And we have post-watching measures of people's liking of the ad and willingness to share. I'll be talking about the ad liking in particular in this presentation. And also for the ads, we have measures based on single source data of the short-term sales impact. And that's something that we are really hoping to explore in the future, is can we predict whether there might be a short-term sales, a positive increase in short-term sales, which is strong versus weak for ads based on the emotional response we can capture. So first of all, I want to show you some results for ad liking. So in red here, you'll see points which represent individual responses to an ad for people who reported disliking the ad, and in green, responses of liking for people that reported they liked the ad they just saw. Each point corresponds to one person's response, so it's mapped into a two-dimensional space to visualize it here. And hopefully, as I show you examples, that will become apparent. So this point here represents the smile response of an individual who reported not liking the ad they saw. And as you'll see, there's a pretty low smile activity during the ad, and that's its highest at the beginning and quickly decreases and stays low throughout the rest of the content. However, for someone who reports liking the content, we see a much more positive style dynamic. So there's higher smile intensity, particularly towards the end of the content, which is a trend that we're seeing consistently across lots of content. However, there's a lot of individual variation, and these two categories aren't separable necessarily. You'll see that some people do smile quite a lot, even though they report disliking the content. But what seems to be important here is the dynamics. And you'll see that the two examples on the right-hand side have similar dynamics. So there seems to be something within the narrative of the ad, or the way the ad was created, which is causing a consistent response, which seems to represent a positive reaction. By looking on aggregate, so taking all of the responses to one ad and aggregating those, we get much cleaner results, because we remove a lot of the noise or individual variations that might be sort of clouding the individual level data. And also, there may be people who are inexpressive, but once we take the aggregate of a group of people watching an ad, we actually uncover dynamics which are perhaps only present for a smaller set of people. And as you'll see here, points that correspond to one particular ad, so the aggregate data for one ad. So looking at this response here, this is the aggregate valence for all the viewers watching that particular ad. And as you see, that ad was rated as disliked or having a lower liking quotient for most people who watched the ad. And you'll see that the valence is pretty flat, that there's very relatively little expressive behavior. Whereas if we look at an example where most people reported liking of the ad, you'll see a strong positive increase, and it remains high towards the end of the ad. However, if we look at one example here, an outlier, again, it seems to show an interesting strong increase in valence. However, it was reported as being disliked by most people. And this is just an interesting example I'll pull out, in which the ad featured, it was an ad for a chewing gum brand, in which people were smiling in the ad. It was an ad about how you could have a nice smile if you chewed gum. And as we saw in the video responses, many people smiled because someone on the screen was smiling, so there was a kind of mimicking behavior. And that could be a reason why this particular data point seems to be an outlier. But you'll see generally that those two classes are pretty separable, and we could quite easily build a classifier which will predict well which of the ads would be liked or disliked just based on the measured emotional response. And you'll see a few more outliers circled there. And these are ads which were reported as being liked, even though the response, the immediate emotional response was perhaps a more negative one. And these are ads which have a cause-related aspect to them. So they're ads which might feature a charity as well as the brand that's being advertised. And in that case, we were seeing that people's initial reaction was perhaps negative to distressing content that might be in the ad, but overall they reported liking. And this is where there's a difference between the cognitive evaluation and the immediate emotional reaction, which is really interesting, and it's something that we'd like to explore further. So now looking at some results related to some of the sales data associated with these ads. Now these are very preliminary results, but I think there's some interesting things to see. So we have a plot here for individual ads, the aggregate level of positive emotion versus negative emotion. And in green, you'll see those ads which performed well based on the single source data. And in red, you'll see the points for ads which performed poorly. And you'll see that those ads which show low levels of positive emotion and very low negative emotion, where low negative represents a kind of strong negative response, if that makes sense. So these are both going in the same direction. So going from left to right is an increase in positive. Going from top to bottom is a increase in negative, if that makes sense. So you'll see in the bottom left-hand quadrant many ads which perform poorly with this strong negative emotional response across the group of people who watched it, and a little positive expression. Whereas you'll see as you get less negative expressions and more positive expressions, we're seeing stronger performance based on the single source data. But this is very preliminary. These are very preliminary results, and this is something we're exploring in more detail. Ideally, we'd be able to find a way of looking at the correlation between the sales success and the effective index which we can measure from people's responses. And for a few of the data points, we actually have these kind of continuous measures of sales performance. And so we're looking at the correlation between those two things. But again, these are preliminary results with a small number of data points, so we can't take too much from those at this point. But the main point of interest, I think, here is the difference between what we can measure through people's reported responses to the ads they're seeing and the things we can capture from their faces, the emotional response we can capture in the moment that they're watching the content. And one of the questions is the face more informative than people's self-reports? Or is it perhaps a combination of the two channels? And my intuition at this early stage is that combination is important. As I mentioned with perhaps the cause-related example, the cognitive evaluation is different from perhaps in some cases from a spontaneous expression in the moment, and a combination of those two sources of data are likely to provide the most informative information about the overall success of that content. That brings me to the end of my part of the presentation, and I'll hand back to Talis.
Well, I'm going to pass the word on to Herb. Herb, what do you think of these presentations? Could you give us your thoughts on also the bigger picture? What do they mean? What do these findings mean?
Very fascinating, very fascinating. And excellent work. I want to put a little spin on both in a way. And I will tell you that I've had experience tracking many hundreds of thousands of shoppers through stores on a second-by-second basis. So tracking people with RFID and whatever is right down my alley. Done a lot of eye tracking and that type of work also. So have some relevance in this area. And I focused on in-store media for many years. The first thing I want to point out is this. A lot of times there's a lot of confusion about the audience. Okay, now, this is an audience because most of you are looking up here and expecting to be participating mentally to a certain extent in what's going on here. That's an audience. You go to a movie theater, there's an audience. When you go into a store, I don't care how many people there are and how much noise you put up in the store, it isn't an audience. And attempting to use, kind of audience type measures. So first thing I'm thinking about is at the NASCAR situation, all of those ads they had around there were studied more carefully by the people putting up the ads than anybody else. Think about this. Your eye, point of focus, moves 100,000 times a day. And I can tell you, you didn't do it. Your eye will keep moving. We won't go into the details of this, but it's doing it. It's moving all the time or whatever, okay? And it may, so you have audiences, and then you have incidental exposures that just happen in the environment. And those incidental exposures, like we used to say, you could take a, you could take a Coke, you could take $1 and those incidental exposures down to the corner and buy a Coke. Or you could just take the $1 down there and buy it. Okay? I mean, the point of the thing is these incidental exposures don't really amount to a lot. I mean, you're looking for a needle in a haystack for impact here or there or wherever. Okay, enough on that. And I think your metrics showed that, basically. So, if you get down to actually measuring this stuff, you'll always find out the same thing. There's nothing there. Okay, no, there was something, but it's easier, I am exaggerating less to say there's nothing there than the people that are typically trying to sell that advertising, okay? Number one, could say a lot more about that. On the other thing, the measurement was being done from computer screens, et cetera, with the camera, whatever. Now, this is not an incidental audience because the person is there looking at that, okay? Their attention is focused. A lot more appropriate to use those kinds of metrics. I found it very fascinating. Personally, I'm an empirical scientist. I'm a biochemist, actually. But I measure things and observe things. And this struck me as a very interesting way to measure the reaction. I have no real challenges with that. So I appreciated that a lot. I did want to point out that was measuring an audience. The first, there really wasn't an audience. Just because you had 100,000 people there watching this thing, they were watching something else. Okay, so, and that's all I have to say about that now.
Okay, so Orlando, I'm imagining you're going to talk a little bit more about the second presentation.
Yeah, well, in fact, I think what I'd like to do is to start by offering a kind of frame for both presentations to try and link them together and to understand what it is that they're showing us. And there's something that's coming through from psychology. There's something that's coming through from the work of Daniel Kahneman that many of you will be familiar with, and there are others too, Damasio, from psychology, that suggests that the way we make decisions is not the way that most of us have been thinking today in this room. So we think much less than we think, generally speaking, that we are guided by what's known as System 1 decision making, which is quick, intuitive, and emotional. And many of the judgments and decisions that we make throughout our lives are made this way. They're not made in the way that we like to think that we think, which is evaluative, rule-based, logical, and slow. So if I said to you, what's 2 plus 2? You're very quiet, but I suspect the answer that came to mind straight away was 4. Now, if I said, what's 17 times 24, and you're a bright bunch, but you're going to take a bit longer to get to that answer. The first answer was automatic, was intuitive, was based over long periods of time and experience, and that's system 1. The second answer you had to work at a little bit. It's rule-based. It's system 2. The answer's 408, by the way. So, system 1 guides our decision-making. We wouldn't get out the door of the house in the morning if it weren't for system 1 that guides us in everything that we do. And this frame, which is all about emotion and intuitive decision-making, links the 2 presentations, I think, here today. The first one about engagement, and engagement at the sort of point of an event, and the second one about advertising and how emotions guide decision-making. And so what I've got up here, I've just got a couple of slides to share with you, some thinking that's coming from the advertising world and the advertising industry, as I'm a practitioner, just to share this with you, is some work that's been done in the UK with the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising by Peter Field and Les Binet. You may have heard of them, foremost analysts of advertising data. And they've taken the IPA findings, they've looked at the efficiency of advertising from the database I suppose the submissions from awards that goes to the IPA every year. Terrific database, probably the best database in the world for advertising effectiveness. And they classified campaigns according to whether they were, by the authors, deemed to be rational, combined, or emotional campaigns. And they found, to their surprise, they've told me this, that the emotional campaigns were the most profitable. They were expecting to see that the combined campaigns would be the most profitable. So the combination of rational and emotional elements. So this was this threw the advertising world up into a furore because surely advertising works by communicating a message that's persuasive, that cuts through to that system 2 brain, which actually we don't like using very much, do we? Isn't that how advertising works? Well, it's not actually. The way that advertising works, and lots of evidence is coming through now to suggest that advertising works by making you feel something for the brand and nudging you towards making a decision in its favor. And that's a controversial finding, but it's actually supported here by what we've seen today and by some work that I've been doing. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to hop over there and show you 2 things. So this is some work I've just done with the Effies, looking at their advertising effectiveness data. And we tested a number of campaigns for which there was advertising efficiency data. And what we found in the US, the land of the hard sell, I appreciate I'm a Brit, the land of the hard sell where information and persuasion-based advertising is actually quite commonplace, what we found was a very similar result to what Les Binet and Peter Field found in the UK with the IPA data. That the ads that we tested, if you ordered them on how persuasive they were, on a persuasion measure, were actually less efficient in terms of the share gain that they achieved relative to their spend than the emotional ads that we had measured with our emotional measure, which also uses faces, by the way, but it's a self-report measure. And the ones in the middle that try to do both, that are emotional and persuasive on pre-testing measures, are not quite as good as the emotional ads. And that reflects what we found with our work at the IPA as well. So we did a similar test with the IPA where we tested campaigns that had got efficiency data in the UK, and we ordered the campaigns that we tested on how emotional they were, that's these 2 bars on the far left, on how persuasive they were, so the most persuasive versus the least persuasive on a persuasion measure, how well brand linked they were, so there's a standard question in pre-testing about brand linkage, how well the brand cut through, and key message, so whether the message was communicated to people in a way that they understood it or not. And the controversial finding here is that this is the number of business effects that were achieved by the best and worst line ads on each of those measures. The controversial finding is that emotion, simply the way people felt about the advertising, was more predictive of business effects in the real world than any of those other traditional measures. Those traditional measures of persuasion, brand linkage, and key message actually discriminate against the most efficient and the most effective advertising. You will only get to be so good if you're relying on those measures. You need an emotional measure to take you to the sort of most efficient level of advertising. And that's my controversial finding, but I think it links together this idea of system one and emotion. Getting you to feel something is really important for creative. We've had some terrific contributions today on the mechanics of advertising. This is about the creative content of advertising, and making people feel something is really central to that. Thank you.
Well, okay, so now, as I've been asked to do, give you guys 3 to 5 minutes to talk in roundtables about the issues that we've talked about here. A few of the important topics that I consider that we should think about is, first of all, the role of brand equity, right? Now we have measures of brand equity. How do we balance brand equity with sales in the short term, brand equity as this ability to capture future sales? We've talked about, in content, we've talked about the role of emotion, the role of attention, and new methods to enable us to track this over time. So we can track and do experiments, we can track and do models, and so this data that was collected in the field in these two studies allow us to really get an understanding of what's going on in the process of how advertising ultimately affects sales, ultimately affects brand equity through different stages. So we're going to start off with Q&A for the panelists. I don't know if we have the mics. Oh, we do have, okay, there, all right. So who wants to start us off? Any questions? If you could state your name and if you could direct your question to anybody in particular. That's
Robert Mee, University of Tennessee. I have a question about the slide where there were 4 quadrants based upon positivity, that was the horizontal axis, and negativity, the vertical axis. If you could pull that slide back up and just comment about what those 4 quadrants were.
It's going to be hard to pull it up. It's in another computer, but I think you explained it very nicely.
Yeah. So the quadrants were just based on median values for the data on each axis. So the quadrants were just to kind of separate the data out, but that they were just based on median values based on each axis. So those weren't anything special. But the idea was to show you that generally the ads which had higher negative responses and lower elements of positive expressions were typically the ones which showed poorer performance. And these are typically ads which people are generally less positively expressive to. Does that answer your question? Yep.
So and yet in sales it was not. It was sort of the northwest and southeast quadrants that seemed to do better in sales, whereas the northeast one in your diagram would have been high positive, low negative, and yet not as positive in terms of sales, if I understood your slide.
So the bottom left-hand corner was the worst performing set. Which is what you'd expect with the highest negative responses. The other 3 were fairly similar. So low levels of negative responses and high levels of positive responses generally suggested more successful. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. It's Igor Mandel. It's question to Daniel. When you explained the design of the experiment, what did your panelists do, in fact? They were sitting and looking only to the web, and you measured that? And if yes, then how could you measure sales after that? If they were specifically selected just to watch the ad and react somehow, do you expect them to buy something after that? It's like quite artificial setting, or maybe I missed something.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Because of the challenges you explain, it's very difficult for us to, or it was difficult in this case to collect data for individual sales for the people who took part in the emotion measurement. So the sales is based on past performance of the ads. So they are a different population, but that was something that was unavoidable in this case. Yeah.
Different population, what do you mean? Like, what does it mean?
Different people, yeah.
So you measured emotions on one people, but measured sales on others, or what?
Yeah, so it was past success based on measures while the ads were actually on TV. Yeah.
It's not very clear. I'm sorry. So let's say 100 people, you measured emotions. Then what you do? Then you go to some other 100 people and measure what they buy, or what? Or they watch the same ads which they'll show, let's say, positive emotions on, or
yeah,
how
so
it works?
We can only measure the emotions on a certain set of people. So these people we recruit to try and measure what type of emotional response each ad elicits. But those aren't necessarily the same people who were measured to capture the single source data, because it's difficult to do both.
So like an ad pretest.
Yeah.
They're independent data sets.
So they're,
Okay.
yeah, I think that
Thanks.
was clear. So yes, go ahead. If you can stand up.
Just a curiosity, when I looked at the people who were polled for their responses, their reaction, they were mostly young people. So it seems like there is a natural selection bias here.
There's definitely a self-selection bias in some cases. So we've run experiments where people have volunteered to take part in the experiments, and therefore we don't necessarily have control over the population. However, we've also run experiments where we've recruited people specifically for this using traditional market research approaches, and therefore in those cases we can dictate the type of demographic we get. So although the images you might have seen might have appeared not representative, they are, we can ensure that they are representative demographic-wise. However, having said that, there is always going to be a self-selection bias because people don't have to consent and take part. So even the older people who take part, they may be the ones who are more open to being filmed. So that's definitely an issue that has to be considered, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question for the panel. And this is a question I'll bring from my students. I know that when they graduate from the MBA program, they ask me this question, which is, how do you build brands? I know that they don't get hired and promoted to keep a big brand big like Coca-Cola. They're hired to work on these small brands and make them big. So what have you learned over the course of your careers and your research on elements of building brands from small or from zero to growth?
I think for me it would be make my brand famous, and that should be at the heart of every advertising brief to any agency, because fame and highly emotional advertising has been shown again and again to be the best predictor of efficiency and the best predictor of growth. So fame multiplied by reach is the recipe for market share gain. So aim for fame and make your advertising emotional, as emotional as you can.
Mm-hmm. Herb?
Yeah, I would, I don't disagree with any of that, by the way. But I would focus on the fact that the marketplace is cacophonous, and you have all of these shouting voices, and so you're trying to work with a small brand, and you need to, my rule is simply this, whisper, don't shout or mumble. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. I think probably most everybody knows who Alfred Hitchcock was. And you know his signature little squiggle. The point is that signature little squiggle is what I call whispering, because it's evocative of the entire Albert Hitchcock. So that's what you're looking for. Most brands attempt to have conversations. They think, well, what we need to do is we need to get into a conversation, explain ourselves to the customer, and we need to, do all this. There's just no way you're going to do that. There's just too darn much noise out there. You have to, you have to take methods that are more distinctive and not loud. And,
sorry.
And a rule that I give my clients all the time, and that is this. If you're in the market, somebody's buying your stuff. And it may not be, you may not be the top, but somebody is. And you need to learn how to sell to those people who are buying it right now more efficiently. Because if you sell to them more efficiently, other people will fall into the hole of efficiency. They'll come right along with it. Selling is all about efficiency of the close, and I could say a lot more about that.
I don't know if we're going in order, but I'm not, I guess. I would say appeal to consumer passion. And because if I find out whatever you're passionate about, then I have your attention. And so right now, if I ask you, what are you very passionate about? I should see lots of smiling faces. And so that's what sponsorships do, I think, and what good brands do that you love. They appeal to your passion.
Seduce, don't persuade, I think.
So
Seduction
in
rather
terms
than persuasion.
of building new brands especially, it is building that brand love and also focusing on your target. A brand that I think that's done it amazingly well over the last 15 years is Under Armour. They first started with professional sports. They very smartly moved into the Little League realm, where they have amazing brand advocates in the Little League. Then they moved into more wider distributed men's apparel. And by the way, they've only been selling women's apparel for about 2 years. But I think every woman in this room knows Under Armour quite well, even though they haven't actually had anything for us for a really long time. So they've done a great job of building that brand love in successive relevant constituencies.
Daniel, do you have any insights on building brands?
I probably have the least experience here on the panel, but I would echo the clarity of the message. I think something we see in our data a lot is that when there's coherency in the responses, then that seems to echo or reflect really strong performance in other measures. Whereas if there's large discrepancies between different subsets of the population, then that reflects a problem in other measures too.
Can I get one call out for the Google friends? I just saw a Google thing. One other thing is for big brands is to continue to keep people guessing. So it's that building innovation and building innovation into your brand. When we build brands on percentile ranks, everyone feels like they know Google. However, Google actually is not at the 100% for knowledge. The consumer is assuming that Google is always going to come out with something new and innovative that they don't understand yet. So they are expecting differentiation and know that the differentiation's there, even if they don't know what it is yet. So that's actually what's kept Google in terms of being an innovative leadership brand, is that they're always doing something new that the consumer is anticipating.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. This is a question for Orlando, and it's based basically.
Where are you? Where are you?
You're right here.
Over there.
You're Claudio
hello.
Marcus from Visible World. Your suggestion on trying to aim for fame strikes me as very potent, but somewhat impractical. It's kind of like swinging for the fence, as opposed to figuring out a way of hitting consistent singles and maybe doubles. And so my question is, that research is largely based on mass marketing campaigns. And so there, the emotional appeal tends to overshadow the rational appeal because you can you can attract a broader base with an emotional appeal, but with the advent of more targeted advertising vehicles, including television, and segmentation and targeting, what do you think will be the impact of a rational appeal that's very highly targeted and timely, as opposed to a very broad emotional appeal?
I take the broad emotional appeal every time, because I'll give you an example. So we do work with HSBC on their global advertising, and I don't know if you've seen the HSBC lemonade advert where the little girl's selling lemonade at a stall. I think it's run here in the US as well. And what HSBC were trying to do there was to appeal to, I suppose, premier type customers, people with high net worth. And they did it through a highly engaging, simple, emotional ad. So it's the best ad we've ever tested for them on our measure. And it worked not only for the broad sample, but for the very targeted sample that they were particularly interested in, so the high net worth individuals. And it's been phenomenally successful. So even though they weren't setting out to drive foreign exchange sales, they have driven foreign exchange sales enormously with that simple ad, a girl selling some lemonade to tourists. So it is going to work, whether you're an 8-year-old girl or a CEO, emotional advertising works. Message advertising, if it works at all, will have to be seen many, many times. Herb talks about the clutter of, all the advertising that there is out there and the multiple messages we're trying to absorb all the time. The more message-based your ad is, the less it will work, and the more emotional it is, the more it will work. And they are at odds with each other. I've got evidence to show that the more the message comes through, the less emotional it is. The more emotional it is, the less a message comes through. And the more emotional it is, the more successful it will be. So broad and emotional, always for me.
Yeah. If I might make a comment on that too. Not disagreeing, not one whit, but I want to point out something that Ogilvy, for example, was a big believer in full-page magazine ads. And the strategy, of course, was that very few people that read the magazine were going to read this full page. So you had a bullet at the top that was the eye catcher that would allow the person to immediately know this is something for me, or no, turn the page, okay? But, and many times he ran these things maybe, 20, 30 times, so over a long period of time. And it might take somebody 5 minutes to read the darn thing, But this is a different, only reason I'm saying this is because this isn't, he wasn't selling consumer packaged goods doing this, or a lot of other things. So I'm just saying, well, there may be a place for more cognitive ads. It's not the area that I deal in myself personally, but I hate to disagree with Ogilvy.
I think most categories, whether it's pensions or pet food, are actually made the decisions we make are actually made very emotionally, because we can't bear to think hard. It's like cats and swimming. We can do it if we have to, but we really don't like doing it. And so the more emotional it is, the better. And if you can give people the reasons afterwards for them to believe they've made the right emotional decision, then all the better. And that's kind of the way we make decisions with System 1, and then maybe different categories have different degrees to which you use a System 2 to sort of post-rationalize it. System 2 is like the press office. System 1 is actually the Oval Office, where all the decisions are really made.
And you just mentioned something that is overlooked by far too many people, the sale after the sale. After the person is bought, providing reassurance. I mean, that next step, especially if it's an emotional decision, is reassuring a customer in one way or the other that they made the right decision.
I suspect preaching to the choir, but since Orlando mentioned it, the book Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, it's a good read.
Any other questions?
What about
Humour, very important. Yeah, it does. Very important. One of Ekman talks about the 12 different types of happiness, and amusement is sort of one of these. And it's one of the things that we measure in our approach too. And it's one of the things that really drives business effects in the marketplace. But doesn't translate very well into tracking research, because when you ask someone how much do you trust the brand, what do you think of its quality and so on, they're not likely to give you good scores on those things. But because you've made them laugh, you've nudged them closer towards you, and it actually is very effective. So yes, I agree with humour. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've actually found that humor drives awareness, but not consideration.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists for being here, and I think we should applaud them for all of the research done.
We've done good.
So now I pass on the mic to Pete Fader with the closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have to tell you how impressed I am after a long day, a beautiful day, by the way. Don't go out and find that out for the next 15 minutes at least. Just how engaged people are, and that speaks volumes. Well, it speaks volumes about all of you, but about the topic as well. So they're giving me 15 minutes here. I'll take 5. And then drinks are waiting for us around the corner, and I think that's more important than anything else. So a couple of quick comments. First of all, how wonderful it is. How it gives you faith in humanity that we can have a full day talking about measuring the effects of advertising, and not a single person asked or said anything about the value of a Facebook like. I mean, that's great. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's more to life than just that. And I think it's good for us to acknowledge it. Second of all, how wonderful it is to start off the day where the very first slide says that the value of an ad is 48 cents, plus or minus 40. I like that we can, let's get, there's the answer. Let's go home. Let's start drinking right away at 9 o'clock. So they tell you that there's no better way to learn a subject than to have to stand up and teach it. That's going to really force you to absorb that subject in a way that, more than preparing for a final exam. And there's no better way to absorb the material from a conference than to have to give the integrative summary comments. So I encourage all of you, seriously, next time you're at a conference and you really actually want to learn a thing or two, pretend that you're going to be giving the summary remarks and that you have to integrate everything. So you're not checking your phone and spending a little extra time in the breaks and all that kind of thing. So here are my 5 summary observations. When you look back at them, they're patently obvious, but I think they are a pretty good reflection of not only what we've covered today, but the state of affairs in the measuring advertising world. First of all, what a wonderful world it is, that it is truly the Wild West. There are just extraordinary opportunities out there. There is no one claiming that they have the formula, that they have the approach, which of course was true for many years. Everyone had their marketing mix model or whatever else, and for decades, we were tweaking at it. We were trying to take the thing and improve it a little bit, but now, who knows? There's just so many great opportunities out there, so many questions to be answered, but even for a given question, so many different methodological approaches, so many different kinds of data that we can bring to that question. It's terrific. I think there's, just like with the Wild West analogy, there's gold in them there are hills, and I think it's great that we're using all kinds of different tools and approaches to dig for it. So that's great, and it's really nice that people are going after that gold so aggressively, creatively, and constructively. So again, unlike the old days of advertising where there were just a lot of petty fights about, my method is better than yours, and a lot of bake-offs and things like that, we're not really seeing that much in the way of comparisons. Not like there's anything wrong with that either, but just here's a new thing and a new way to measure it and a new way to look at those results. So that's great. And so that leads us to actually one of the first points that Eric Bradlow raised when he kicked things off early this morning. And he did a great impersonation of a dean, didn't he? So And that's the idea of making connections and collaborating. And a big part of that is kind of the obvious point, which is academics and practitioners, that we all stand to gain a lot from each other, yada, yada, yada. You've heard that before. You wouldn't be here unless you believe that. All true. But I'm talking about a different kind of collaboration, a different kind of connection. There's something implicit in almost every talk and very explicit in every hallway conversation, which is I have this kind of data, you have that kind of data, let's talk. So the data connections that we're making, the kinds of just, even forgetting about the models and the insights, just the data integration. I mean, everyone is collecting way different kinds of data, and can we find a way to mesh it with yours and create extraordinary synergistic insights that would be impossible with each data set by itself? That's really great, and I want to see more of that, and that all the more reason why I want to finish up quickly so we can have drinks and talk. And talking about data is even better over drinks. So that's real important. And I also want to point out that I love to see the creativity that's associated with all that data. Some of you might have read an article in Wired magazine a couple years ago, Chris Anderson wrote, and it was saying that with all the data that we have, it's the end of theory. Basically, we just have enough data now, we don't need to think anymore. And as someone who's in the thinking business, that's rather troubling. And I think that even though we're collecting a lot of data, it's an interesting paradox that the more data we have, the more creative we're getting. So we're becoming increasingly creative about the ways to collect the data. We're becoming increasingly creative about the things that we do with the data, and becoming increasingly creative about not only the business decisions that arise from it, but the business models that can be created from these clever new data sources. So that's great. And of course, it's wonderful to be a data geek and nerd. We're becoming the cool kids now. Not quite there yet, but we're getting close, and pretty soon the world will be ours. So it's great to see all the new data connections that are emerging. Number 3, there was a great question that Kirk raised. I don't know where Kirk disappeared off to. There he is. At the end of the 3rd session, something like, so what's new here? And there were some really good answers to that question. I think Brian stepped right up and said, well, we can do geo-targeting in a way that was just unimaginable before. So there's no doubt that there are very good, very valid, very meaningful answers to that question. But I still like that, I don't even say skepticism, but I like that respect for old world marketing. That even though there's a lot of new stuff out there and a lot of new stuff that can be done, there's still a lot that we can learn from not only the old data, but the old metrics and models and mindsets that were associated with it. I mean, our forefathers worked so hard to get tiny slivers of data that can't compare to what anyone was talking about here. But that hard work was solid, and we should, instead of just saying, oh, well, those old models don't apply now because we have new kinds of data, you know what, people are people, behavior is behavior, emotions are emotions. And so we really owe it to ourselves and to our forefathers, the true data scientists, not the technicians that we call data scientists today. We owe it to them to better understand their methods and try to marry those old methods with the cool new data that we have today. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the talks that we've just experienced aren't necessarily entirely new methods. They were, some of them, well-established methods with just cool new data, and we just want to see more of that. And so we want to continue to read the history books of old marketing models, but instead of finding ways to reject them because the data is so different today, let's celebrate them and come up with elevate some of that old work. And talking about celebration, a lot of what today has been a celebration of variance, right? So right from the first session, we were talking about all these different sources of variability. So whether it's natural variability in some of the field experiments, or some semi-contrived variability when we're turning certain things on and off, it's really great because marketers, I hate to say it, used to be afraid of variance. I mean, we can calculate a mean with the best of them, right? And so for so many years, our field was all about just give me this mean and tell me if this thing is higher than this thing, let's make a decision and move on. And we left it to the people in finance, the smart people in finance, to do things with variance, right? But today, we are celebrating variance just as much as they are. And we understand, I mean, going back to the comment that David made early on, some of these old studies where you're trying to look at an advertising sales relationship, if you don't have any variance, you have one data point and you're stuck. So we realize that we need variability. We need to look for sources of it. We need to create it on our own in order to get the insights. We can't be afraid of it. And so we're getting really smart about doing that, about creating it and exploiting it. And that's terrific, because that's going to be the future. The fact that so many hands go up when Ellie asked the question, who's out there doing experiments, is right there, implicitly a tribute to variance. And so let's continue to appreciate that. But now let me give you the flip side of that, which isn't to say down with variance. There are no two words I hate more in the English language, at least when said together, than it depends. I hate that, because very often we use those words to acknowledge ignorance, that, I don't know the answer, it depends on, no, but today we're really coming to understand the it depends kinds of things, that we really appreciate contextual differences. And again, we've seen that through all of the talks. It's not a matter of rejecting the work because they give us an initial mean, but then let's go on and show how it varies under different kinds of circumstances. And what I find interesting about that is that very often when we're just starting out, we're not interested in context. Let's just establish these original effects. Let's just take this cool data and do some analyses with it and say, here's the results. And then leave it to other people to, later on, future research, to figure out the it depends stuff. So in many ways, the it depends, the contextual understanding, is a sign of maturity. That we're kind of now chewing on the bones a little bit. We're trying to figure out the limiting conditions and some of these marginal factors and so on. I think it's great that we're asking the it depends question. We're understanding some of these contextual effects right at the beginning. Okay, so instead of just saying, treatment A is better than treatment B, boom, we're done. We're actively looking for those limiting conditions and finding out ways what it depends on. And so while asking those questions is often a sign of maturity in the field that, there's only so much we can do with the data, we better just look in the corners for these context characteristics, it's a sign of a different kind of maturity. I think a kind of intellectual maturity, that we're asking those kinds of questions and seeking out some of those contextual factors right off the bat. So those are my 5 big observations. I don't know, I hope you've enjoyed the day. In fact, let me take a moment right here. I want to thank everybody on the WCAI and the FOA team for everything that they did, and I think that they deserve a round of applause. And you have seen many of those people around, but there is one person who deserves far more thanks than I have to say everyone else combined, and that's Marina. Marina, can you stand up? So Marina Krikorian. This whole thing, from the organization of the program to all the printed materials to the arrangement of the tables, Marina, I thank you very much. Terrific stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed the day. But in a way, it kind of leaves you maybe a little bit unsettling that you came here with a lot of questions in mind, looking for the answers. And again, Garrett gave us that answer, 48 cents, plus or minus 40, right? We're done. But I really think that we actually leave with more questions than answers. So again, this is the Wild West. We're not just tying a ribbon around anything. We're opening up new horizons about advertising measurement, advertising practice that I hope you hadn't even thought of before walking into this room. So more questions than answers. And of course, there's a lot of different aspects to those questions. It's not a matter of just jamming data together and seeing what we can do with it, but understanding how it's going to affect business. And a point that Dave Riepstein raised early on, and many of you echoed, understanding the long-term effects of it. Again, it's far too early for us to be able to answer that question now, because for so many of the phenomena and data collection methods that we discussed, the best we can do is short-term. It's all so new. But we definitely want to keep that long-term in mind. It's going to be here before we know it. But before we know it, the day is going to be over and you're all going to be brain dead. So with that, I'm going to call this meeting to a close, and I say we adjourn to drinks and chit-chat. So thank you very much.